So this is gov.uk. This is a website, the best place to find services, information about government services. And gov.uk is coded entirely in the open. So all our code is on GitHub. Until quite recently, there was one repository that wasn't open, and that was the AlphaGov deployment repository. So this repo was private because it contained production secrets. So things like database passwords, credentials, that kind of thing. But this being closed presented a blocker for the team, the fact that it was production secrets. Because we're government, you need security clearance to get access to production, and that can take some time to come through. And we don't tend to give junior developers access to production for a while. So that meant that if any stories came up that involved making changes to the deployment code, it was blocked behind the few people on the team who had access to production. So what the team did was they created a new open repo, and they moved the deployment code to the new repo, and they moved the production secrets into environment variables, which is good practice anyway. So that meant now that basically anyone can work on the deployment code, and that meant that they weren't blocked and slowed down behind, there wasn't a blocker there of getting the code out based on who could work on it. So that is one example of the way that coding in the open can help you release faster. In this talk, I'm going to tell you about how we got to a situation where the UK government is coding in the open. I'm going to tell you what the benefits are of coding in the open in general. I'll talk about how it can help you release faster. My name is Anna Shipman. I'm a technical architect. I work at the Government Digital Service, and I'm the open source lead. So that's the lead for open source across the UK government. I've actually left GDS. I'm leaving next week, so this is my last talk about GDS. So how we got here. The Government Digital Service was formed in 2011, and our mission is to transform government. So we started with the gov.uk site that was launched in 2012. And now, since then, we've been working on helping government be digital by default. So I'll give you some examples of what I mean by that. For example, registering to vote. So it used to be that when you registered to vote, you would have to fill in a paper form and then send it in the mail back to your local council. Now you can register to vote online. Another example is viewing information about your driving license. So again, if you wanted to find out how many points you had on your driving license or something like that, you would have to fill in a long form, send it through the post back to DVLA, and at some point in the future, they would send you back information about your driving license. Now you can look up that information online. All new government services have to meet something called the Digital Service Standard, which is a set of 18 criteria about what makes a good digital service. And point 8 of the Digital Service Standard is make all new source code open. So basically, all new government services now have to make their source code open. And over the past 6 years, a huge amount of government code has been released in the open. So it's 50+ government organizations have been coding in the open, thousands of repos, tens of millions of lines of code. Just a brief note about coding in the open. So coding in the open is technically open source. Open source just means software with its source code made available that's released under a license that allows the software to be freely used, modified, and shared. So the GDS code is coded in the open. The software's, the code is freely available, and the GDS code is released under an MIT license. But we call it coding in the open rather than open source because we aren't, packaging it up for other people to reuse. We're not expecting people to necessarily take it for reuse. We're basically just getting on with our job, but we're doing it in the open. So that means when you raise a pull request, that's in the open. When that pull request is reviewed, that review takes place in the open. When it's merged, you can see that as well. So now I'm going to tell you what the benefits are of coding in the open. 3 kinds of benefits. It makes the code better, it makes your organization better, and it makes government better. So talking about how coding in the open makes the code better, the headline here is basically when you're coding in the open, everyone tends to basically raise their game a bit. When anyone could see what you're doing, everyone tries a little bit harder to raise their game. So that means things like people work harder to write good commit messages because anyone in the world could be looking to see what your intent was when you made that code change. People make sure to be positive and constructive in code reviews because anybody could be looking at that conversation. People make an effort to follow good architectural principles, again, because people can see what you're doing. So basically, it raises the quality of the code across the board. Another way that coding in the open is good for the code is because it means everyone has to be responsible for security. So it's possible to develop in such a way that you write your code and then it goes through like some kind of security gatekeeping where they review it for security and check that code is secure. But when you're coding in the open, you can't do that. Because as soon as you've committed your code and pushed it, that's it, it's live, everyone can see it. So that means all developers need to have a basic understanding of security principles, which is good. I mean, that's good practice anyway. Like testing, everyone should be responsible for security, everyone should be responsible for testing. And another way that coding in the open is good for your code is it means other people can help make your project better. So you might be familiar with this site. This is the e-petition site. So on this site, you can raise a petition. If it gets 10,000 signatures, then the government will respond to it. If it gets 100,000 signatures, it'll be considered for a debate in Parliament. A couple of years ago, there were some really high-profile petitions that got a lot of signatures. It used to be that when you loaded the page, this number referred to the number of people who'd signed the petition when you opened that page, and it wouldn't change. But somebody added the ability for this to upload in real time. So now, and you might have seen this if you're signing a popular petition, if somebody signs it while you're looking at it, that number will update in real time. So that person doesn't work for government. He found the code on AlphaGov, he changed the code, raised the pull request, and that was merged and deployed. Another example on the same project, I said that if it gets over 100,000 signatures, it might be considered for a debate, or is considered for a debate. And when a debate is scheduled, the date that it's scheduled for is known, and somebody else added a call so that you could actually see that date on the petition site. So again, this person doesn't work for government. He found the code and raised that pull request, and that was merged and deployed. So I don't want to oversell this point, right? It's not that as soon as you open your code, suddenly you'll have a whole army of people willing to do extra work for you for free. But it does make that possible. It makes it possible for people to make the changes that they want to make. So in this scenario, if the code had been closed, like these people would have had no option but to raise a ticket somewhere that might have gone into a backlog that might or might not have been prioritized. Okay, so coding in the open also makes your organization better. One of the ways it makes your organization better is it makes it a lot easier to work with other people. And I'll give you an extreme example to illustrate this point. So the GDS has something called the digital marketplace, which is how government buys things. And the Australian government also has a need for a digital marketplace. And so people from the Australian government worked with the UK government team. They shared the code of the digital marketplace to build their own digital marketplace. They made some features, added some features, and made some bug fixes on the UK government's version. And this was possible. I mean, basically, these two teams worked together, even though one of the teams was in the UK and one of the teams was in Australia. So when your code is in the open, you don't need to sit next to the person you're working with in order to see their code. And you don't need to enter any kind of complicated business arrangement about how you can see the code or work out any kind of complex access control. You can just work together. Another way it's good for the organization is it makes it really easy to share learning. So the example I want to give about this, so gov.uk has got a format called Smart Answers, which is a way of presenting complex information so that it's much more readable. So the example here is calculating your leave and pay when you have a child. So the rules around maternity, paternity, shared parental leave and pay are very complicated. But instead of presenting the user with a wall of text that's like, in this situation do this, or if this, then that, what a smart answer does is it asks you a few questions and then gives you the information that's relevant to you. So like, when's the baby due? How long have you been with your current employer? How much do you earn? And then it tells you the information that you need to know. So there's another part of government called the Education and Skills Funding Agency, and they run the apprenticeship scheme, the UK's apprenticeship scheme. Every organisation that has a payroll of over £3 million has to contribute to the apprenticeship scheme, but they can also get credits back to pay for their own apprentices, and the amount that they get back varies because different apprenticeships require different amounts of training. So it's really complicated to work out like how much they have to pay and how much they get back. So that team wanted to launch a tool to make it easy for people to work that out. And they started the work, and they estimated that it was going to take them 2 to 3 months to do the work. And then someone in the team said, have you had a look at the Smart Answers code? So they went to look at the Smart Answers code, which is open. And it didn't do exactly what they needed it to do. The Smart Answers code is in Ruby, and their project was in C#. And there was a feature that the Smart Answers code didn't have that they wanted. But what they did was they used the Smart Answers code as a template. And they basically copied what they needed to write their own tool, and they got their tool up and running in a week. This is a blog post about that. So that's not a perfect open source story, right? A perfect open source story is they got the Smart Answers code, they used it, they contributed back some features for everyone. But it's a really good story because it took the Smart Answers team like several months to learn all the bits about how to make that tool work. And then this other team were able to use their learning to get their own tool up and running really quickly. And so when you can actually show the code, it's really easy to share learning like that. And open code also advertises your interesting work. So when a company codes in the open, you can go and look at their open code and see if that's the kind of thing you want to work on. If their code review is positive, that can act as a really, that can show that it's a supportive environment to work in. And when you're talking about your work, you can show off your actual code. So next time you're here up on stage, wouldn't it be really nice if you could actually point at the actual code that you've worked on? So another way of putting all those points is coding in the open is good for recruitment and it's good for retention. And finally, on this point, I'm going to talk about how it makes government better. So there are loads of ways that coding in the open makes government better. I'm just going to talk about one of them right now. You can see what work is being done with public money. So it's really good for transparency. So coding in the open supports a culture of openness in many other things. So all the developer documentation for gov.uk is open. You can go and see how all that fits together. Architectural decisions on gov.uk are made in the form of RFCs, requests for comments. That is in an open repo on GitHub, so you can go and see how those decisions were made. The gov.uk roadmap is open. Unfortunately, we are just too early for the 2018-19 roadmap to be published, but this 2017-2018 roadmap has been out for most of a year, and so you could go and see what is coming up for gov.uk. This is a Trello board for one of the teams on gov.uk, so you can actually go and see what work they're doing, and this is open. And finally, when we have any kind of incident on gov.uk, like an outage, we have an incident review session, an incident report is written, and those are then published on gov.uk. So you can do all of those things without coding in the open, but when you do code in the open, that is a really good foundation for all these other things to happen. So it supports a culture of openness, and that is good for government. OK, so now I'm going to talk about how specifically coding in the open helps you release faster. None of these points are about literally making the build run faster. Like if you've, the changes you can make to optimize the build, you probably have already made those changes. The blockers for releasing are, apart from the speed of the build, are cultural, they're social, and they're organizational problems. And coding in the open can help like every stage of the release lifecycle, from like working out how to integrate with tools, to the build itself, to how you actually share releases. So first of all, I'll talk about integrating with other tools. And when you code in the open, you can share implementations instead of specifications. So I'll give you an example of that. Gov.uk Verify is a service that sends messages to users, text, emails, letters, that kind of thing. And other government services can plug into, sorry, did I say Gov.uk Notify? Did I say that? Anyway, yeah, I didn't mean Verify, I meant Notify. Gov.uk Notify sends messages. And other services can plug into gov.uk Notify. And so they don't each have to write their own mailer for their own service. Prison visits booking is from the Ministry of Justice, and it allows you to book a visit to see somebody in prison. And you book online, and then an email confirmation is sent to you a couple of days later. And the email template they use is very complicated. So here it is, and it goes on. It's a very complicated email template. And so the technical architect from Prison Visits Booking was talking to the gov.uk Notify team to find out if they could support sending that email with gov.uk Notify. And she could just share a link to the code, because the Prison Visits Booking code is in the open. So she just shared a link to this complicated template and said, will you be able to support this? And then the gov.uk Notify team could look at it and see whether they could, whether there were changes they could make to be able to support it. So if that wasn't coded in the open, she could have had that conversation, but she would have maybe had to write a specification, which would have taken extra time, and there's increased possibility of making mistakes when you're writing what the code does rather than showing what the code does. or they would have had to set up some kind of arrangement where they could, both look at the code. Whereas this way, she could just share the code and they could just get on with releasing faster. Okay, so another way it speeds things up is it makes it really easy to see how other people are using tools. So an example of this, gov.uk a while ago upgraded to Jenkins 2, and as part of that, they changed the way that they stored the Jenkins files and created Jenkins files. And a bit later, gov.uk Verify, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, another team within GDS also wanted to upgrade to Jenkins 2. And they could just go and look at the gov.uk Jenkins code. So it's really, when other people have coded in the open, it's really useful to be able to go and look at what they've done, and you can see how they've actually used the tools. You don't have to rely on reading a blog post, for example, that might not contain all the information you need. There might be some key thing missing. If you can just look and go and see how they did it, then you can get that done much quicker. Another way it helps you release faster is open code helps you get around organizational and legal barriers. And this, I'm really happy about this example. So last Friday, I went to another conference called Scale Summit, and somebody came up to me to thank me for the blog posts I'd written about how to make code open and other resources I'd shared. And he told me about the situation that he'd been in. So he works for Time Inc., which is the company that owns Time magazine. And they had a team in the US and a team in the UK, and they both worked on they both shared the same release tool. So this release tool was like a wrapper, it was just a wrapper around Terraform. And developers from the UK and developers from the US both contributed to this tool, and they both used this tool. So the UK arm of Time Inc. has just been sold to another company. And the legal team told them that they could not continue to use this release tool. So what they did was they used some of the resources I'd shared to persuade the legal team that it was a good idea to open source this code. And so now they've made this release tool open, and both teams can continue to work on it. So basically, when you code in the open, your tool chain is resilient to your organization changing. Another advantage of them open sourcing that tool, so I said it was a wrapper around Terraform. The person who'd originally written the tool left Time Inc. and went to work for HashiCorp, who make Terraform. And occasionally, the Time Inc. team would invite him back, buy him lunch, get him to come and sit in the office and help them with some changes they wanted to make to the tool. And he was at the conference as well, and he said it's much better now. He doesn't have to go out of his way to go back to the office. They can just send him a link to the question they want to ask and link to the code, and he can answer them. So I mean, this leads on to another advantage. Coding in the open means that anyone can work on your code. So this is the example I gave at the beginning, and this example where this person had left Time Inc., but he still wanted to work on the code. It's not always the case that people want to work on code when they've left, but sometimes people do. And when you code in the open, that opportunity is available to you. It's easy for people who've left the company to continue to work on it, maybe people who are joining the company, or as in the first example I gave you, people who are new to the team, maybe wouldn't have access to everything, can work on that code. So moving along through the release cycle, I said when you code in the open, people can fix your code. People can also fix your build. So I help run another conference called SPA Conference, Software in Practice. It is a brilliant conference. You should all come. It's in July. And the website for SPA is a Jekyll project that's in the open. So a few months ago, I moved the site to HTTPS, and this broke the build. I didn't realize it broke the build. This is something I do in my own time. So I was out for the evening, and one of my co-chairs wanted to make a change. She wanted to deploy some code to the site, and the build was broken. Because it's open, she could go and see the builds. She could go and see what the exact issue was with the build. She could work out how to fix it, and she could raise a pull request to fix the build. And this was all before I even knew anything had gone on. I was out for the evening. Before I'd got back, this was all resolved. So before I made the code open, she would have had no choice but to have emailed me to say there's a problem, I don't know what it is, and I would have had to deal with it that night or later, and the whole thing would have been slowed down. And finally, I want to talk about how coding in the open makes sharing the actual releases easier. So I said I was going to talk about gov.uk Verify. This is a government service for verifying your identity, and it's a federated identity service. So it means that government doesn't have to have a database of everyone's information. What gov.uk Verify does is ask questions of an organisation that you already have a relationship with. So, for example, I might have an account with the post office, and gov.uk Verify says, is this person who they say they are? Then gov.uk Verify sits in front of government departments and services like HMRC, DWP, DVLA, that kind of thing, and they ask gov.uk Verify, is this person who they say they are? And that information is passed around securely using SAML, which is Security Assertion Markup Language. So SAML can be quite tricky to get the information out of, to decrypt. And it's quite easy to make mistakes in the code that you use to interpret SAML. So what the gov.uk Verify team do is they produce a tool that the service providers, so like HMRC, DWP, etc., they can use to get the information out of the SAML. And they need to release this regularly, like if there are new features or any kind of bug fixes, that kind of thing. So what they used to have to do was, the release would be created, it would be a zip file. Somebody would have to manually upload that to bin tray. Then they'd send around an email. The email would be PGP signed so that they know that it's from Verify, that it's really from Verify. And then it was time sensitive. So if people didn't go and get the release within a week, then it would have expired and they'd have to send a new email. So there was a lot of manual stuff going on in that release process. Now, gov.uk Verify code is open. And so what they do is they just create the release on GitHub and send an email. There's no need for the PGP signing because you know who it is, right? You go, you see that it is AlphaGov, you see that it's gov.uk Verify. There's no need for the time sensitivity. People can get the code as and when. So basically, that actually speeds up, takes out all the manual stuff, and it speeds up the process of sharing the actual release. And there's another advantage of having the release open like that, because it means that the changelog can actually show what's actually changed. If you're really interested, you can do a diff between this version and the current version. So that's taking you through kind of the entire release lifecycle. Some examples of the ways that coding in the open can unblock some of those barriers. There's one extra thing that I haven't mentioned, which covers the whole coding lifecycle, which is that coding in the open tends to be cheaper. And that is because many services are free for open code. So GitHub is free, Travis continuous integration, and Circle CI, which is continuous integration, AppVeyor, which is continuous integration for Windows, Snyk and SonarCloud, which is security scanning, Dependabot, which checks your dependencies, CodeClimate, which sees your test coverage. And those are just some examples. There are loads of tools. These tools are all free for open code, and they're paid for if your code is closed. So this is a big deal in government because buying things in government takes a long time. We can't just pull out a credit card and buy something. It has to go through a process to make sure that it's being procured fairly, which is good, but it can take a lot of time. And even outside of government, like buying things can take time, like getting that business case that costs money signed off can take time. And if you don't have to shell out any money up front, if you can get started free, then those business cases tend to go through a lot quicker. So you can just get started on writing your code and releasing your code much faster. OK, so those are some ways that coding in the open is good for your organization and good for helping you release faster. I'm going to talk now about some of the challenges of coding in the open. I'll just talk about a couple of challenges. The first is it can be difficult to get started. It can be a bit stressful. If you've come from an organization that's coding privately and suddenly your code is out there and anyone can look at it, that can be a bit stressful. So it's really important that you have a strong culture around being positive about code review and being supportive around it. So at GDS, we have guidance on how to review pull requests. We also do things like linting automatically. So the code reviews don't descend into like a religious war of tabs versus spaces. That's all taken care of by the automated linter, and the actual personal conversation can be at a higher level about the design. So it's basically, if you are coding in the open, it's really important to have a strong culture around being supportive of people. And the other main challenge for coding in the open is making sure that you don't publish the wrong thing. So, I mean, I said everyone has to be responsible for security. but there is a possibility that the wrong thing will be published. So there's a few things you can do around this. You can have processes that make it harder to make mistakes. So things like storing your secret separately in like an encrypted store rather than with the code. You can set up pre-commit hooks, which scan your commits for anything that looks like credentials or data before you push that commit, so that information never gets leaked. But the fact is, as we know from like various high-profile breaches constantly, problems will happen even if the code is closed. And coding in the open, keeping your code closed can give you a false sense of security. Coding in the open forces you to address these issues right from the beginning. It forces you to think about what you're going to do to protect the security of your code, rather than relying on the idea that the code could be closed. Because even if the code is closed, that doesn't stop somebody leaving open like a world writable S3 bucket or whatever. So basically, the thing to remember is, so coding in the open is good because it forces you to do things properly from the beginning. But the thing to remember is that mistakes will happen. Like, it's a fact of life that mistakes will happen. And it's more important that you're able to recover quickly when mistakes happen. So actually, there's a really good blog post about this. It's written by John Allspore, which was included in this slide deck before I knew he was going to be at this talk. So basically, this talks about how the important thing to optimize for is the mean time to recovery rather than the mean time between failures. Because mistakes will happen, and the important thing is that you're able to recover quickly when they do happen. OK, so those of you who aren't working in government are probably thinking, right, that's fine, that's all very well, but that's fine for government because we don't rely on profits from the software we build, right? Government is not a money-making endeavor. So I'm just going to give you some examples of companies that have open code. So The Guardian codes in the open. The Financial Times codes in the open. Netflix. So Netflix don't code in the open, but they do release a lot of open source code. And the reason I mention them is because when you go to the page that outlines what Netflix works on, the headline, before they even start telling you about the code, is "Come and work for us." So they clearly see that coding in the open is a really strong recruitment tool. OK, those are all companies that are selling their content, not the actual software. So now I'll talk about some companies where the actual software is the business. So GitHub. GitHub do a lot of coding in the open, and they also release some open source projects. One of the open source projects they've released is libgit2. Libgit2 is the engine that GitHub runs on. And one of GitHub's main competitors, GitLab, uses libgit2 to run their competing service. But you don't see GitHub going out of business. So this is something that can work for them. It's OK to share your code. It's OK to share your secret source. It doesn't kill the whole endeavor. And another example is Feedbin. So Feedbin is an RSS reader. It allows you to follow updates on blogs you follow. And Feedbin is a paid-for service that costs $5 a month. But Feedbin is entirely open source. So if you wanted to, you could take the Feedbin code and you could run your own Feedbin. But people still pay Feedbin for the service because it's easier. OK, so hopefully you're all thinking this is great. If you're not already coding in the open, you're thinking this is fantastic. Like, how can I get involved? So I've got some suggestions for you. You can make code from your company open. The video for this talk will be published in a couple of days. You can use this to help persuade people, or you can use some of the resources that I've published. When I publish the slides later, I will share links to some of the resources I've mentioned in the talk. You can have a look at the government code. So the GDS code is in our AlphaGov organization on GitHub. There's a page on GitHub that has a list of all government code that's on GitHub, not just UK, but across the world. Or you can come and work for government. Make things open, make things better. Thank you.